5 narrow little windows.
We tend to see things in visual terms, almost entirely. We say, show me. We won't believe it unless I see it. It seems to have escaped our notice that a lot of what we see is what we want to see.
Can reality, as we know it through our 5 senses, be altered? In the following conversation, the biologist and author Dr. Lyall Watson discusses some personal experiences and ideas with Leslie Smith.
Seeing is believing, just one of the many rule-of-thumb guides to reality handed down through the generations. But of course, as a true test of reality, it doesn't stand up to close scrutiny. Many things we automatically believe in are invisible, and some things we do see are unbelievable, especially if they look impossible, and so we reject them. But trained scientific observers, like Dr. Lyall Watson, can't afford to be so dismissive, as, for example, on a visit he paid to Venice.
I was invited to go there because the Italian translation of my book, Supernature, had came out in May '74. One of the people who bought Supernatura was a man employed in a hotel in Venice who, on his days off and on his hours off, goes across to the Lido to play tennis with friends. He brings his tennis things home, and in his house, in his home, with his wife, and he's unusual in that he has only 1 child, unusual in Italy in this respect, this little girl of 5 picked up his tennis equipment and began to do something very strange with it. And when it happened, what he did was not take her to the priest, or to tell the priest what had happened for fear of being excommunicated, but he wrote to me. And in a mixture of pride and terror, which I found impossible to ignore, and I replied and eventually went to see them. What happened was this. I went to have dinner with them in their apartment, which is near Santa Maria dei Miracoli. And we were sitting, enjoying a meal of fish and polenta, and I was glad they invited me to dinner because I had a chance to watch the child, and she had a chance to get used to me. She was just 5 at the time, a very tiny child with wispy hair and rather strange, silent demeanor, very self-composed, with enormous eyes that peered right through you, that took you apart and reassembled the bits and then went back to what was important and just ignored you. After dinner, she was sitting reading a magazine on the floor, and Father and I were talking. Mum was washing dishes in the kitchen, and he picked up a tennis ball from a tube on the table next to him and rolled it across the carpet. Came to rest right on the magazine she was reading. She looked up with that very discerning eye of hers and sort of nodded quietly to herself and said, "Oh, well, here we go again." Picked up the tennis ball, held it rather affectionately to her cheek, and then, holding it in her left hand, began to caress it, as though it were a little furry animal, a hamster, to be treated with great love and respect. While she did this, crooning gently to it as though it were a dormouse to be wakened from untimely hibernation, the damn thing woke. Something happened. It moved. One moment we had there in this child's hand a tennis ball, the well-known sphere with its little carpet and that meandering seam, clearly recognizable as a tennis ball. The next moment it wasn't. There was a sort of a dull sound, like someone drawing a cork in the dark. And it changed. It was now a black sphere, smooth, quite unlike a tennis ball in all respects. She got up and handed it to her dad, and he turned it over to me. I wasn't at all sure I wanted anything to do with it in any way, until I realized...
A little gruesome, did it look?
No, it was a disturbing thing that had happened. I wasn't sure I wanted to be involved. Then he handed it to me, and suddenly I realized what it was. I could recognize it, although I'd never seen one like it before. It was an everted tennis ball, turned inside out. Still pressurized. I dropped it and it bounced. but turned inside out, so the black rubber was on the outside and the fur was on the inside. I proved this by getting up and taking a knife from the kitchen table and cutting it in two. And as I did so, the air hissed out, and there inside, where it had no business being, was the pile, the fur. Now, I'm enough of a physicist to know that you can't do that. Not in our reality. There's no way you can do that.
As you were telling me about it, I had the feeling it was going to turn out to be living. It was going to turn out to be some little animal or something. Where did I get that feeling from you?
Well, I have the feeling, too, that we're dealing here with an artificial distinction between living and non-living. In a very real sense, everything boils down in the end to particles or wavicles or whatever the basic building block of matter is. And its basis is that it doesn't exist. It's made of energy alone. And this applies equally to rocks and people. We tend to think that a rock isn't alive simply because it sits still. But in real terms, in behavioral terms, sitting still is a perfectly good piece of behavior. In terms of survival, it's worked extremely well. There are lots of rocks around just to prove that it works. We tend to think that a dragonfly which darts is alive because it doesn't sit still. But this is an artificial. To look at it this way is not to give either state of being, either state of matter, its true nature, full justice. So I do tend to think in terms of everything being alive, and if you do this, it helps a little to come to terms, not to understand what happened with that tennis ball, but to come to terms with the possibility of it happening.
I must, of course, ask you if you got a repeat performance from the child, or if it
Yes, many times.
Oh, many times?
Yes, I carried a ball away and was able to show it to other people.
You
In
mean
the end,
the ball after ball was handed to her while you were there?
She got very bored with it. No, we did 2 that night, and in subsequent visits, several more.
Exactly the same process each time?
Not quite the same, but the same result.
I'd like just to be able to picture it a little more clearly. How close was she sitting to you when this happened?
Oh, heavens, you're thinking in terms of conjuring, but as
No,
a 5-year-old
I'm
child...
not. No, I want to get a more vivid picture from you.
At the closest, I was holding her hand as it happened.
And could you just describe again to me what you saw happening? Was it
You see a tennis ball, and then you see something else. There's no
mean very
intermediate...
sudden?
It is,
instant?
yes, this is common to experiences of this kind. There is no intermediate phase. You don't see a transformation taking place. I never was able to film it. I suspect if you did, between one frame and the next, it would take place. It isn't a transformation. It is an alteration of reality. It is another reality being imposed on the old one. And I think you can do this because if it's true that reality is partly at least a construct of consciousness, in other words, reality is something made by the mind, you change it by changing your mind. This is a terrifying concept, but I think that's the only way we can begin to look at this.
Well, are you suggesting that this child, somehow or other, directed her mind towards this object, that she had a different concept of it from most people?
Absolutely. Because that child is now 9. We're now 4 years on since I first saw that. And she stopped doing it. She stopped when she went to school. And this thing was produced and talked about and decided to be impossible.
And therefore she couldn't do it?
Yeah. And so she stopped doing it. So she can't do it anymore.
Did she do any other strange thing?
Never. Not one, no. I was hoping she would bend spoons and all the usual things, but it didn't interest her. Tennis balls did. She enjoyed them. And it was only that one thing that ever showed that she, at least, and I think this is common to many children, can, simply because they don't know it's impossible, do things which we consider to be impossible. And I think we can take a lesson from all this, and that is that nothing is impossible.
Nothing is impossible. Well, of course, this kind of claim is automatically suspect. Nothing is impossible. It sounds rather like a kind of pulpit platitude designed to promote our best endeavors, rather than a proposition with any scientific basis. Has it in fact any meaning? If nothing is impossible, everything is possible, but where does that get us, especially in terms of reality? Must we not at least have the evidence of our senses, as well as our intellect, before we can accept anything as real? Surely science is fact.
I don't think it is, Leslie. I think that we as scientists tend to look down our noses at folklore and myth, and to ignore the fact that much of what we believe is based on very slight evidence, that science is in fact something that involves a mythology of its own.
A mythology?
I
Seems
think
a
so.
contradiction in terms, that.
No, I think that scientific fact is not as absolute as people who are not involved in science would like to think.
What sort of things do you have in mind here?
Well, we tend to think that scientific fact is independent of time, of place, of person. But when you look at it very carefully, you see it's not based so much on observation and fact as it is on a political, social process in effect. To give an example, if I believe in the electron. Now, I've never seen an electron. Nobody ever has. I don't have the equipment, and even if I did have, I wouldn't know how to use the equipment to prove that an electron exists. So I have to accept somebody else's word for it. In this respect, I'm one in millions of people in the street who have to believe what other people tell them. In other words, that articles of hard scientific fact, like the electron is assumed to be, in the end boil down to matters of faith. And much of science is a matter of blind faith of this kind. It boils down to the realization that there never was such a thing as total objectivity. Everything is subjective. If we are involved, it is necessarily subjective. In other words, my opinions always color the facts. And there isn't such a thing as a fact that isn't heavily weighted with theory, with myth, if you like.
Myth often suggests something false.
No, a myth is something which is not necessarily real in the sense that you can measure and touch it and weigh it here. It's a convention. We have drawn up elaborate conventions about how we think things are, and we all agree that certain things are and other things aren't. We couldn't operate unless we had conventions of this kind.
So
they're laws, if you like. But the distinction is that they're not the laws of nature, they are our laws of a certain kind of nature. And that is the major insight of the new physics, that nothing is true in an absolute sense. Everything is approximate. You can only assess the relative probability of something happening. No one has ever yet seen an atom, but despite this, physicists talk with great confidence about all these subatomic particles. And there's a growing number, there are now hundreds. About 2 new ones are discovered every month. In this Alice in Wonderland of the atomic nucleus, there are now very strange things, with strange names, leptons, quarks, hadrons, with marvelous whimsical properties like charm and strangeness. But it's an embarrassment of riches. And the physicists themselves are now beginning to ask, is nature really like that? Or did we invent these things? The reason they ask is that every time someone comes up with a new particle, gives it a name and a property, others begin to look for it. And more often than not, they find it too. Very often in exactly the place where they looked before without seeing it. One tries to double check in the situation by going to cosmic rays and seeing if you can find it there. And very often it turns up there as well. But the doubts remain because all the systems of detection are man-made. And we could be creating that which we seek to find.
Systems of detection man-made, but how else could they be made?
No other way. This is the catch-22 of the whole thing. Consciousness is involved in all of our decisions about reality.
Consciousness, no doubt, but surely evidence too. The inquiring mind, as well as the skeptic, requires so-called tangible proof.
When Charles Darwin on the voyage of the Beagle got down to Tierra del Fuego, he found that the Fuegians, who had always had little boats in which they'd ferried themselves between the islands, could not see the Beagle. It was too big to be encompassed by their imaginations, and therefore it didn't exist. Until they were taken out and allowed to touch it, until it became an objective reality within the terms, the confines of their method of operating, it didn't exist for them. I'm afraid that because of our current, in many ways still restricted, view of reality, that we may be missing things in the same way.
What sort of things?
Well, take a simple view. I suspect that if we continue to put technologists into space, if our astronauts are people who are trained technologically, that they might miss things which a poet would have seen. In other words, if we do one day come up across another form of life, a sentient being, and I very much hope we do, because it would be marvelous, it would be very exciting, but it may be so different that unless you were prepared to accept vast differences, you may not experience it at all. There may have been something on the moon that those people just didn't see. Now, I know this is a rather far-flung example, but I suspect that we are missing things in this way, that because we have restricted reality to certain parameters, there may be things that we just don't see.
Or perhaps it is that we are likely to see just what we expect to see. But what of the situation where a person is evidently able to see what common sense would say simply can't be seen? Lyall Watson took part in a series of experiments with a young American woman who claims to be able to move out of the body and thus see things, for example, in another room, which ordinarily she simply couldn't possibly see. Indeed, Lyall Watson, too, claims some experience in this out-of-the-body condition.
I have done it to a limited extent. I have worked with people who do it regularly, on demand and at will, particularly a young girl who can sit in a quite conscious state in a studio such as this and move out, apparently, on instruction to a room next door and look at what is there and come back and tell you what is there, even if she has physically never been there. And even if I myself have never been there. So it's not telepathy working, but it seems a real out-of-body activity in which she can learn and bring back the information she has learned. And it doesn't matter whether she's put into experimental situations or not. She nearly always does it.
Nearly always, not absolutely.
No, not at all. Nothing works that way. Not even the best machines work that way. She isn't a machine. She sits, she doesn't even have to go into a trance state or be hypnotized. She just sits in a chair. You say, well, look, I'd like you to try and visit a locked room next door. In this room, we have a digital clock, which is running, and it's random, and it will stop when it feels like it, when its sequence is finished. And displayed on it will be 5 digits. Nobody knows what those 5 digits are going to be because it's totally random and the room is locked. I want you to go in there and wait until it stops and then read the 5 digits off and tell me what you see.
In other words, leave her body temporarily and return when she's done this.
After a while, she says, okay, I've seen it stop, and it says 57432. And she is right 9 times out of 10, and she has produced information which nobody has. Absolutely nobody anywhere has that information. So it can't be construed as being telepathy or...
In other words, there's nobody in that room next door at all.
It's an empty locked room.
Is she able to transport herself in this fashion to anywhere at all? A house, perhaps, that you would direct her to that she's never been to?
She is a very psychic, strange person and claims to have gone out into space, gone to all kinds of places in the universe. There's no way we can objectively measure what she is telling me.
But I mean, if she were here now, for example, and she were invited to go from here in an out-of-the-body way to, let's say, the television centre, which is some miles away in quite a different part of London, and into a particular studio, and to come back and tell us what she'd seen, would she be able to do that?
Very often, yes.
Although she'd never been there at all?
Well, this girl actually worked in television, so he doesn't know how much is cryptomnesia, but...
All right, that's...
I've never tested those kinds of things because there are no controls possible. And it's possible that she heard a producer friend talking about the program or had been near someone in the train who was discussing the script, who was writing it the day before. You never know.
Suppose, however, she came right off a plane now and were brought in a car here to the studio now. And you hadn't seen her for some years, and you asked her to transport herself in an out-of-the-body way to the home you have acquired in Oxford, recently acquired. Could she do that?
It's possible. We have a connection, and she tunes into me regularly and writes me letters or tells me
on the
telephone something I have done.
This could be telepathic.
Again, yes. You
So
can't
that wouldn't be a
eliminate
fair
the
test.
possibility of all those things working. The little test I told you about is the only one where I can be sure that the information I'm getting is something nobody alive anywhere has and could not have acquired other than by out-of-body activity.
Is she, do you think, a freak?
No, I think everyone has this capacity, but some people can produce it more regularly on demand than others can.
Could it be that because the young woman took her ability for granted, she was able to make the apparently impossible become apparently possible? Maybe just like the Italian child with the tennis ball. Lyall Watson has another example of the impossible happening before his very eyes, the so-called Philip experiment. A book was written about it a year or two ago. I had put it to him that one of the points he was stressing was that there's no such thing as absolute, objective, scientific truth or reality.
No, there isn't, and I'll tell you why I believe this. I'll give you another example. There is, in Toronto, a group now known as the Philip Group, who provide a fascinating example. They're based on a man called George Owen, who is a professor at the University of Toronto. What he wanted to do was to explore the experience of seeing a ghost. Now, he has lots of experience with poltergeists, and they're very real. Every police department in the world knows they exist. He wanted to make his own poltergeist. They decided what they would do is to actually create a reality of their own. What they wanted, they thought, was a man. We want to see a person. And they decided what he was going to be like. We'll call him Philip. He's going to be the ghost of a man who died in the 17th century in England. They drew a picture of what he should look like. They got a picture of a house from country life in which he once must have lived. They drew up a whole biography for him, and then sat around, this group of 7 or 8 people, every Thursday night for 2 years, trying to conjure him up. They never got him, but they got something else equally interesting. One evening, towards the end of the 2nd year, one young guy in the group, he's a taxi driver, was younger than the others. There was some horseplay going on. They were just playing the fool, and suddenly the table moved, apparently of its own volition. And they discovered that whenever they suspended reality and became deliberately childlike in this way, in other words, they threw up the description of reality which we accept and decided that it wasn't quite like that, things happened to them. Psychokinetic phenomena occurred.
Just moving table?
Usually it's the table, yes. They've had a variety of tables, some weighted down with lead and iron and bars of iron until they were very difficult to move in any way, but always the tables move. Now, when I've been with them, it's been really quite dramatic. The night I was there the first time was with a reporter from Esquire magazine who had a photographer with him. And the table, entirely on its own, unconnected with anybody, nobody was touching it at the time, pursued the photographer from Esquire magazine and had him pinned up in the corner. He'd abandoned all his equipment and was screaming. We actually had to take the table off him. Now, this happens not under the conscious control of anybody in that group. They never know what's quite going to take place. It doesn't depend on any one of the people there. It's psychokinetic phenomena, PK by committee. All that they need is a quorum. About 3 out of the 7 have to be there for it to occur. The point is that perfectly ordinary people without any psychic pretensions, but simply with an interest in doing something, can make it happen. Can alter reality simply by deciding that that is what they want to do. So yes, I suggest that it is perfectly possible and even commonplace for this to happen. And that we have to begin to think as natural scientists, what might be the total effect of a large number of people believing something very unlikely? Because there are now cults which are growing to this size of millions of people believing unlikely things. It may be that a myth becomes a reality if enough people believe that it is true. And that could be something with quite serious consequences. I find it exciting and not disturbing, but it's something we have to think about.
And even to think about it can be disconcerting. But don't let's get too far away from the evidence of our senses. After all, most of us have little else to depend on, though no doubt it's true that our senses are geared by upbringing and training to apprehend and to interpret according to widely shared preconceptions. And maybe thus, as Lyall Watson asserts, denying us the possibility of discovering other realities and other interpretations. Could it be that people whose senses are in some way impaired view reality quite differently, yet equally validly?
I have found in the last few years that some of the most exciting experiences I have had have been with people who deal with other kinds of reality by virtue of their inability to cope with all the senses, all the normal 5 senses. Blind people, deaf people, children who don't have the normal adult bias of the senses in which we now exist. We have learned to read, and I think this has given us a very distorted view of reality. We tend to see things in visual terms, almost entirely. We say, show me. We won't believe it unless I see it.
Seeing is believing.
Seeing is believing. It's all the old saws. But it seems to have escaped our notice that a lot of what we see is what we want to see.
Of course, it's difficult, isn't it? Life has to be lived. And sometimes it's a bit difficult to cope with it. So we have to go along with certain preconceptions, don't we? We have to believe that we have a train to catch and that it's due in at such a time and that when it's there we shall see it and get into it. That there's a boss who's got to be pleased, a form that's got to be filled out, a tax that has to be paid. We've got to go along, haven't we, on certain
We have to have conventions. Without them, nothing would work. We are built on conventional lines. We have to be, otherwise we wouldn't exist. We are flooded every second we live with information, pouring in, not only from the media, but from the cosmos. We're flooded with facts that are coming in all the time, sensory information. What we have in fact done is to construct 5 narrow little windows on reality through which we peer at this massive information.
our senses.
Just that. But we mustn't lose sight of the fact that this is what we've done, and that what we have created is an artificially confined and restricted view of, in fact, what really is.
You say artificially confined and restricted, but isn't it necessarily confined and restricted, since life has to be lived?
It's necessary in terms of the kind of life we have decided to live. The rather mournful philosophical fact that the only creatures that see the cosmos as it is are perhaps bacteria or amoebae who haven't restricted themselves in this way. Only they know how it really is. But, of course, we've made the conventions for conventional and useful reasons, and my only concern is that we don't end up believing that that is how it actually is and nothing else is possible.